Today, we're going to be discussing how to seize the means of production in only 2 generations without even having to have a revolution. And there's specific advice for what you can do to help seize the means of production. So, basically, capitalism, it's a pretty great system. It's worked very well for the last couple hundred years. Probably will continue to work pretty well. And just generally, produce more goods and stuff, increase well-being. It's just been pretty awesome. But there is kind of a contradiction in it. Because the profits, they're companies, right? They make their profits, which is the difference between what they pay to people and their expenses and how much they're able to bring in. And then that gets distributed as dividends to the shareholders, which are pretty much always rich people. Because if you own stocks, you're probably rich. If you're not rich and own stocks, you'll end up being rich in a couple decades as long as you're not investing in dumb companies. So yeah, the shareholders are pretty much always rich people. And these rich people, when they get their dividends, don't usually spend it on stuff. Again, if you have the kind of mindset that you're going to get rich, you probably aren't spending that much on stupid stuff unless you're super, super rich where you can actually afford it. And if you do have that mindset where you're spending money on stupid stuff instead of reinvesting it, you're probably not going to stay rich for long. So the Darwinian process just kind of naturally results in rich people being people who are going to be stingy and reinvest the profits and dividends they get from their businesses or stocks they own. And the largest companies are pretty much always publicly traded businesses. The vast majority of shareholders, which are rich, and then when they get the difference between what they pay people and what they're able to collect, those dividends go to the rich people. Except here's the thing, with this process, naturally, and obviously there's productivity growth and stuff, that's going to lead to a gradual increase in wages and things. But there also is naturally going to just be wealth gradually shifting to the people who own the stocks and things, which essentially constitute the means of production, right? And so what this means is that if you don't have a stake in this, which usually some people do via a 401k and stuff, they have some stake in this, but usually not that great. And a lot of people don't really start doing this until they're older, which is kind of dumb because when you're older, you have more money. But there's way more risk if you start investing when you're older because you don't have as much exponential growth. So let's say you start investing when you're 30 and then it doubles every couple decades until you're 60, right? And so then that means you'll have 8 times as much money when you're 60, meaning if there's some market crash and the market goes down by half, you still have 4 times as much as you invested when you were 30. Whereas if you start when you're 50, you double your money every decade, which is what the 7% average stock market return over the past century comes out to. Then you are going to lose all of that, all the gains, right? So you basically it's the same as doing nothing. And so it's best to, start investing early, but that's not the way the current system really helps people do it. So yeah, so in order to seize the means of production non-violently in only a couple generations, what you need to do is we as, regular people need to start having a larger stake in the financial assets to which profits are distributed. And so what this means is starting by just buying more financial assets, usually stocks, and don't just choose some company and put a bunch of money in it because you could get rich, but you probably won't. You might just lose a whole bunch, which is not what you want to do, but probably just putting your money in an index fund or a wide variety of companies, some of which are in different industries, then you won't lose a whole bunch of money and you'll, gradually go up over time because the average, there'll be some that make a lot, some that lose. But on average, there'll be a gradual increase that's eventually gets exponential. And so, several decades from now, you'll have a whole bunch. And essentially, what needs to happen if average people want to have control over the means of production is more people need to start doing this. And so then what'll happen if more people have a stake in the companies, don't just think of stocks as a little thing that moves around in price. Because, this is the only person who actually managed to consistently beat the stock market, Warren Buffett, and probably there are a couple other people. But, this is kind of his way of thinking as far as don't think of them as something that moves around in price. Think of them as partial ownership in a company. Because in the short term, they're little things that move around in price. In the long term, they're partial ownership of a company that only exists basically with rich people today. But if the middle class and potentially poor people who would be much more difficult to, but wouldn't be poor anymore if they did this, owned a greater share of the biggest companies, then they essentially would have a stake in the means of production and would be getting profits when they spend money. That money doesn't just go to the company, and part of it goes to the workers and such, and part of it goes to the shareholders. Part of it would go back to them. And so essentially that's kind of my idea for how the workers can seize the means of production in only 2 generations. And I said 2 generations because it'll take a really long time. So you just can't tomorrow just start investing in the stock market and then just be like, see, I'm rich now. Because if you're actually doing sound investing instead of just gambling, it'll take forever to actually build wealth, and you probably don't have that much extra income to invest at first. But if you start investing usually in, like older companies that'll provide dividends and such, so that way even if the underlying value of the stock goes down in a certain year, you'll still be making money because you get part of their profits. Just doing that for several decades, the dividends will eventually start buying more and more shares, and then those shares will provide more dividends and buy more and more shares. And so the first generation will need to really start doing this, by buying some more speculative companies, but mostly just by having the average person own a much higher number of blue chip stocks than they do right now, which is basically nothing. So the first 25 years is just do that. Contribute like 5 to 10%, maybe more if we want to have rapid seizing of the means of production, but it just isn't like everybody would need to do this, right? So it isn't reasonable to just be like everybody should invest 20% of their money. But if you do, then you're, helping contribute to seizing the means of production for the middle class non-violently, so that would be kind of cool. But yeah, it isn't that reasonable to expect average people to do it. So the first 25 years, first generation plan is to do that, right? Gradually invest more and more money into dividend-paying blue chips, which will, gradually increase in value and are less risky and will pay out dividends. And then I believe it takes 25 years is about the amount it takes for capital to naturally double with a 3% dividend yield, not including the increases in share price. So yeah, that's what's going to need to happen. The middle class is going to need to build more of a solid foundation first. And this is also really important because generally, like just psychologically, and I'm not a trained psychologist or a financial analyst, but like I have thoughts and I think I should be able to share those thoughts, even though I'm a child. Won't be tomorrow. But yeah, basically I think the amount of wealth in value producing financial assets, not just something you hold speculatively like Bitcoin or like a penny stock or something, but like an old blue chip company that you own part of. Like I think that really takes down stress a lot, because this is just a different tangent about like happiness, which I guess I'm like not wise enough to comment on entirely. But here's kind of an observation I have, is that like the little everyday things don't contribute that much to happiness. Like people who end up getting paralyzed don't end up that much happier or less happy later on. People who win the lottery don't end up that much more happier. Like day to day, usually it's more about the lack of stress, and then also like having family or just like people you enjoy being around, which I'll probably talk about later. But basically, lack of stress is probably the most important long-term factor in happiness, and being able to own a part of a company that is going to keep being around basically forever probably contributes a lot to lack of stress. So that's kind of the objective we have in the first 25 years, right? First generation, the average, and this can happen in America or the world. I'm going to be talking about it from an American point of view. Basically, the average American needs to be less stressed and have a financial stake in a decent number of blue chip companies that are going to be providing dividends, right? And then the second generation, basically we want not only to have those dividends start being reinvested, but also have the second generation be the younger people start investing more and more money, as well as we can start having the older people, when they're at the peak of their earnings, start investing more and more as the middle class. And so if this actually happened, there would be some danger of like a market bubble, just because of human nature. If a whole bunch of people started investing, it would bid up the share prices, which is why, I'd recommend doing it via an index fund, or, stakes in individual blue chip companies that are at reasonable PE ratios, preferably below 20. Even though right now I think a decent amount are over 20. So maybe now isn't the best time to invest a whole bunch in the stock market. Maybe it is. I don't know. You can't know what's going to happen a year from now or even 5 years from now. You just know that 50 years from now it's going to be way, way, way higher. So, yeah, that's my idea for how to seize the means of production non-violently in 2 generations. And if people did this after 2 generations, basically the average American middle-class family, and especially the middle class just as a group, would have a large enough stake in large financial companies, which by this point, blue chips will also mean like companies like Google and Facebook, which are tech monopolies, which can only, because they're natural monopolies, right? Companies like Google and Facebook, that you can't just break them up. Like there will always be one search engine that pretty much everybody uses, just because of the nature of it. Having more users and more data makes it a better product. Like if you think about like an old monopoly, like having more oil, like I guess there is naturally like the industrial economy of scale, but that has its limits. Having more oil, like Standard Oil wasn't a better product because it was a monopoly. Google and Facebook are better products because they're monopolies. So the old kind of breaking them up won't work anymore. But if the middle class collectively, via each individual family having a couple $1,000s of stock in these tech monopolies, which is slightly different from the blue chips I was talking about earlier, you'd probably need like a balanced portfolio, obviously, to have less risk. But that's kind of the only reasonable way I can see of like, maybe there's a different reasonable way, but like the options are pretty much just let wealth inequality get way out of hand, try breaking up big tech monopolies, which won't work, and having the government control these tech monopolies, which also, like, it might be better than having private companies for a few years, but like that's going to go wrong. No matter what, if the government is controlling data on that level, it will go wrong. So what you want is probably private companies which the middle class collectively owns the majority of shares in. So yeah, that's kind of my idea for how the middle class can seize the means of production in 2 years. And what's both bad and good about this idea is that the government can't just be like, yeah, we're going to do this now. Like, it's something individuals have to do, which actually makes it different from a lot of other, like, utopian, like, we're going to change the world ideas, right? Because generally the reason utopias fail, it's because it's like, here's this idea for how we're going to make the world better, and then I have to be in charge. Like, there has to be a central authority that's going to help make everything better, which never works out because the central authority always ends up being corrupt because of human nature. But with this kind of idea, it's decentralized, right? And so just every individual, including you and me and everyone, can help by buying shares in, sound companies and gradually increasing the middle class's stake in financial assets and ultimately like of companies in general, so that when a dollar goes to the economy, it doesn't just go to rich people, it goes to average middle class people. Like, anyone can do this and contribute to the process. It doesn't need to be some utopian vision of a government saving everyone. It's something we can do tomorrow. So yeah, that's kind of an idea I had. Yeah. I just thought that was kind of cool that I like thought of things like this before I'm even an adult. Which maybe I'll look back and be like, I'm dumb. He was wrong. That 17-year-old, he's stupid. Or maybe I'll be like, wow, I was so wise as a child. But yeah, bye y'all. That's my 2 cents. Wait, that's a YouTube channel that talks about stuff like that. Snap, I need to come up with something else to say. Well, goodbye from the child George. When by the time you're watching this, only the adult George shall survive, even though I kind of act like an adult now and will act like a child even when I'm 18. Because I like trade stocks and have a Google Play Store license, and I can guarantee I'll still act like a freaking idiot even when I'm an adult. But bye!